Hello, I'm Betsy Sinclair, professor of political science, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Andrew Reeves and Steve Smith, coming to you from Washington University here in St. Louis. With just a few short weeks until the election, we are here to talk about the U.S. congressional races and break down what's at stake in these races.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask it to Steve. Okay, We've seen Senate norms change dramatically.
Yep.
Starting in 2013, we lost the 60 vote requirement. We lost the judicial filibuster. Now, with the McConnell switch, it looks like Senate norms are changing dramatically. How do you think the 2020 election is going to change Senate norms, if at all?
Well, it depends a lot on how the Senate races turn out. I think we're going to see more of the same if the Republicans manage to hold their majority. Of course, if it'll matter whether or not they're working with the president of their own party or not. And that shapes an awful lot of what goes on in Congress. But McConnell's not going to change his stripes. If he remains majority leader, then I don't think we see much change. The Democrats are a somewhat different party. They have seven, 8 moderates who will probably want to find a way to work with the Republicans. Democratic majority, if there is one, will not be so large that Schumer can live without those 7 or 8 Democrats. He's going to have to allow them an important voice in order to get things through the Senate. And I think things will tone down considerably, and the ball will shift back to McConnell. Will he be just as obstructionist as the minority leader as he was in his last tour of duty as minority leader? Remember, most of this obstructionism in the Senate grew up under McConnell's watch as minority leader. So the Senate is still going to be pivotal. We don't think the House is going to change party control there. Most of the models show a 9-1 or 8-1 probability that the Democrats will retain control. You know, they won a majority in the 2018 midterm elections, and sort of by all rights, the historical pattern is that they'll lose a few seats this time, but they have an awful lot going for them. And so we'd expect a few seats gained or a few seats lost in the House, and that's about it. And with the House Democratic majority now is 232. There are 4 vacancies. 3 of those are in seats held by Democrats previously. So, at a natural 235, they're going to have to lose a net of 17 seats in order for them to get down to 218 apiece. And I don't think that's going to happen. The Senate is where all the action is. And right there, the modeling seems to show that the Democrats have a slight edge, maybe a 3 in 5 chance of winning a small majority. So the majority is going to be very small. It takes 60 votes to end a filibuster. They might have, the Democrats, at best would have 52, 53 seats. Are there enough Republicans, left to get to 60? Moderates, Republicans left to get to 60? Not a chance, because, if the Democrats take a majority, it'd be because they beat a couple of Republican moderates. So there aren't going to be enough Republican moderates. So we're going to be back to stalemate in the Senate. And their ability to overcome that, I think, will depend more on the president than on senators.
Assuming that Biden wins and Democrats take Congress, take the House, Are we going to see are we going to see the size of the court change as a response to the fact that Trump has now appointed 3 justices?
Well, it would also require that the Senate go Democratic because a Republican Senate would never approve of enlargement of the court. So then the question is, if the Democrats are a small majority or still in the minority, what would happen? Well, they'd really have to be in the majority to have any chance of getting this through. And so far, I haven't done a very precise count, but I think I've heard about 6 Democrats already announce that they would be opposed to court enlargement. So they'd be far short of a majority, let alone a supermajority, for acting on that. Should the Democrats be able to keep the party together for an enlargement of the court, then they'd face a filibuster. And is this a kind of issue in which they would go nuclear and break the filibuster for regular legislation in this case, a bill to enlarge the court. I think the betting is that they would not do it over that issue. They might do it over something else, like a voting rights bill, a COVID relief bill. They're just passing a bill to avoid a shutdown of the government through December 11. And on December 11, they'll probably extend that for a short time. So we might face another shutdown bill. I could imagine them going nuclear on that issue in January, February, but not over court enlargement. For this to matter for the Democrats, it would have to be a substantial court enlargement. The liberals are going to be outnumbered 6-3 on the court. To get to 7-3, they need to add 4 new justices, not just 2, the way many people are talking. Just 2 wouldn't do them any good. They won't go to bat for that. So, and 4, I think, would be seen by the public as quite radical. They'll want to do it, but I don't think it'll happen.
Steve, could they go nuclear in an ad hoc manner? Clearly, they do it already with judicial nominations. Yep. Could they say this bill is going to be set with a bare majority, and this one will allow for will require cloture?
Yes, they can do anything they want, and that's the somewhat regrettable feature of going nuclear is that a simple majority is simply doing it by brute force. The idea of going nuclear, after all, is changing the Senate's rules through a point of order, backed up by a Senate majority, rather than following the Senate procedure for changing its rules, which would allow a filibuster against a change in the rules. If a majority gets a mind to just ignore the rule for a particular piece of legislation, they can make a point of order that reflects that. On a somewhat related subject, there is serious discussion going on among Senate Democrats right now about filibuster reform anyway. They realize that if Biden is elected president and the Senate goes Democratic, that the filibuster will be the major obstacle to getting the Democratic program enacted. And so there are many Democrats, especially liberal Democrats, led by Senator Merkley from Oregon, who are considering how to and in what way to reform the filibuster practice. But we should just add that it does look like the number of Senate Republicans who are up for re-election and in deep trouble seems to be growing by the day. We basically have, I count 5 Republicans who are in the toss-up category in several aggregate polling estimates. A couple, Sally in Arizona and Gardner in Colorado, who are even rated as likely losers right now. So that's looking pretty good for the Democrats. 6 months ago, we would not have said that the Democrats had much chance of taking a Senate majority. And today, they're slight favorites to do that.
You had asked us about the most important problem when people answer surveys and they say, what is the most important problem facing America today? And something that people don't usually say, but that is true, is the economy. And the things that people are saying right now are actually mostly non-economic issues, but they're things where, there's rising concern. It's the nature of government, the coronavirus pandemic, and racism. And I think those are the big national issues for which people are frustrated with the Republican Party. And I think that that's part of what's going on right now is, people's perceptions of the most important issue, the most important problem facing American today are largely these other issues. And the economy isn't doing that well.
I'd add healthcare, which is associated with the pandemic. There are an awful lot of people who are concerned about the future of healthcare. And the Republicans have made some headway in making law enforcement a bit of an issue, flipping the coin on race for the most part. But it's really strictly a Republican issue so far.
Andrew, you have a new book coming out about presidential power and legitimacy. Will you tell our listeners about your research and what you found?
It's a book about how the public views unilateral presidential power. And we're thinking about it in a pretty abstract way. It's basically when presidents are out there doing things that Congress doesn't want them to do. And I think we have a pretty optimistic finding there. Partisanship is a big part of that, right? When you like the president, you like to see him use unilateral powers. But we also find that legitimacy and sort of respect and deference for the rule of law also helps shape those views. So there's not the massive partisan split that you would see on something like presidential approval or some of these other issues. There's literatures that we borrow from that talk about, this sort of American civic tradition that's instilled in us from little kids when we learn about the Constitution and things like that. And I don't think that's a surefire thing to prevent us, to prevent legitimacy from slipping away. But it does make me optimistic that, Americans do actually care about this stuff. I think partly we see that in some of the people we might not expect that are coming out and opposing some of the things that Trump has done that are perceived oversteps of his authority. So maybe that's a positive thing to think about and hope for as we move forward.
In recent years, partisan gerrymandering, or redistricting that favors one political party over the other, has received a lot of attention. Steve, will you talk about the effect gerrymandering has on elections and political representation in the U.S. House and Senate?
On the whole, Democrats are packed into urban areas in the country, and Republicans are spread more thinly across the broad geography of the nation. One result of that is that we have in the House, many Democratic districts are heavily Democratic, and Republican districts are only, more slightly Republican. The result is that Republicans have a kind of a built-in advantage. This has been due in part to gerrymandering, with Republicans in state capitals structuring the districts to maximize the number of seats won by their party in those states. It's also a function of the fact that we've got some states that have only one seat in the House of Representatives. They have very small population, and they all go Republican. So that ends up with, in the House of Representatives, a kind of a built-in Republican advantage. This is beginning to change a little bit, thanks to some states adopting nonpartisan commissions for redistricting, and more federal courts stepping in. Actually, for 2022, we're probably only going to have about half of the districts in the country being decided by a partisan state legislature that can manipulate the districts. About half of the districts in the country for the House of Representatives are going to be protected either by a nonpartisan commission or a court ruling, or there's a third possibility, and that is divided party control of state government, so that the two parties have to work it out in a reasonably fair way. The Senate has also got a Republican bias right now because every state gets 2 senators, whatever its size. And the smaller states, especially in the West, are disproportionately Republican. So the Republicans pick up a bit of an edge out of proportion to their numbers. Democrats outnumber Republicans in the country, but the Senate obviously has been in Republican hands for some time, and the House goes back and forth between the two parties, when all along Democrats have outnumbered Republicans in the country over recent decades.
This has been a really informative talk, and I appreciate your time today. Steve, Andrew, before we close, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, if we weren't persuaded before this administration that politics matters, we should be now. We've seen some fairly major changes in public policy, tax policy, environmental policy, education policy, national security policy, the standing of the United States in the world. Virtually every aspect of American national public affairs has moved several steps to the right during the last 4 years. That might be something you favor, it might be something you oppose, but you no longer can say that politics don't matter. Who wins this election will affect you, and it will affect the country for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with Steve 100%. And the social scientist in me is, and the citizen in me is excited to see what the future holds. I see a lot of people running for office who look different from people who have run for office in the past. So I think there are, potential unintended or unforeseen consequences of this time that might provide us with exciting upsides and changes in politics that we might not be thinking about right now. So I think that's an exciting thing to look out for.
I think that Andrew and Steve have done a nice job. So I'm going to add with one thing that I think happens because we're at WashU. And so we're talking to WashU students all the time. And it's that there's a recent survey, the Harvard Institute of Politics survey, and it comes out and says 63% of young Americans, that is Americans under the age of 30, say that they're going to definitely vote in this general election. And that's different than 2016. So in 2016, only 47% of that demographic said they were going to definitely vote. And I think what we're seeing here is a really different way in which people feel like their voice matters. And so if there's a silver lining to the pandemic and the economic turbulence and the fact that so many of our students are taking their classes through Zoom, it's that suddenly the fact that there are real consequences to the politics of the world they live in, they're really feeling that call to action and they're taking action and they're doing things. And I think we're likely to see a number of them turn out to vote.
Could I just add one example here? My wife is a school teacher, and on Monday nights now, we Zoom in and watch the Board of Ed meeting. And the Board of Ed meeting, there used to be 5 or 10 people that would attend, and now there are hundreds of people who attend. Now, part of that is because there are some relevant decisions that they're making, but they're already thinking about how to retool when they go back to a physical setting to allow for people to participate via Zoom. So I think there are things like that. I mean, we might be talking about Zoom democracy in a couple of years based on the changes that are coming about now.
I want to use that as a segue to talk about Magnify, which I always plug every opportunity I can. So I built a civic engagement app based upon the research in my first book. And it gives people a pretty easy way to take part in their local government and advocate for issues they care about for local businesses and to build a kind of digital community, to RSVP for civic events that are happening in their communities and see who else is going, with easy buttons to click to be able to contact their local representatives. And I think people for a long time had this sense that, if they just complained about something and it was just them, they wouldn't be heard. And in fact, that's basically true. If it's just your voice, you get lost in the noise. But there's also really great research developed through randomized trials to see how people can be heard by state level representatives and lower level representatives. And it doesn't take a crowd. It basically takes a group of 22 people. And with 20 people, you always get a response. And so I think these kinds of ways in which people are able to advocate for things like policies from the school board meetings, or, the new crosswalk, or, a different kind of composting system, are going to be all of these ways in which the pandemic and this rising surge of participation by a new demographic of voters is going to really transform the American democratic system. It's really in contrast to what's happening, I think, at the national level, which is a lot of vitriol. At the local level, there's actually a tremendous amount of hope and engagement. And I think that's like a really nice place to think about where the future is headed.